Throughout history, superstition and beliefs have inspired some of humanity's greatest acts of compassion, but they've also inspired some of its darkest moments. People have been imprisoned because of what others believed, tortured because of what others feared, and sometimes even lost their lives because rumors, suspicions, and convictions could never be proven. For centuries, entire communities have convinced themselves that certain people have supernatural powers. They believe victims could curse crops, spread disease, control the weather, and bring ruin to their neighbors. And in the name of those beliefs, countless people suffered. But that was long ago, and things like that stopped by the 20th century, right? Well, in 1945, in the heart of the English countryside, a 74-year-old farm laborer was found brutally murdered in a field beneath Meon Hill. The crime shocked investigators. The circumstances baffled Scotland Yard, and almost immediately whispers began circulating through the village. Whispers that the victim may have been a witch. More than 80 years later, the murder of Charles Walton remains unsolved, and it leaves us with a disturbing question. How far are human beings willing to go when they believe that true evil is standing right in front of them? At first glance, Charles Walton seemed like the last person who would ever become the center of an international mystery. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't famous, he wasn't involved in politics or scandal. In fact, by most accounts, he was exactly the kind of person people tend to overlook. Walton spent most of his life working the land. He knew the fields, the hedgerows, and the winding footpaths around Lower Quinton better than almost anyone else. Neighbors described him as quiet and reserved. He wasn't known for drawing attention to himself. He lived a simple life in a part of England where life itself hadn't changed very much in generations. But there were stories. There always seemed to be stories. Some villagers would later claim that Charles Walton had been regarded with suspicion for years. Others said he kept to himself because he preferred solitude. And after his death, people began looking backward through his life searching for clues. That's often what happens after a shocking crime. Details that once seemed ordinary suddenly take on new meaning. Rumors become evidence. Coincidences become warnings. And before long, nobody remembers where the truth ends and the legend begins. Valentine's Day of 1945 began like any other day. The Second World War was entering its final months. Europe was still at war, but victory finally seemed within reach. Across Britain, people were beginning to imagine what peace might look like. That morning, Charles Walton headed toward a field near Meon Hill to work. Nobody had any reason to believe it would be his last day alive. As the hours passed and Walton failed to return home, concern began to grow. Friends and neighbors started searching the surrounding countryside. Eventually, they found him. The scene waiting for them would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in British history. Charles Walton was lying in a field. His throat had been slashed. A walking stick lay nearby. And most disturbing of all, a pitchfork had been driven through his neck and into the ground beneath him. The weapon had not been removed. It remained standing there almost like a marker, almost like a symbol. The sheer violence of the attack shocked everyone involved. This wasn't a robbery. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. This wasn't a random accident. Someone had wanted Charles Walton dead. The question was why? And that question would only become stranger as investigators dug deeper. Almost immediately, the murder became something more than a homicide investigation. It became a witchcraft story. The reason had everything to do with local folklore. For centuries, parts of rural England preserved old beliefs surrounding witches, curses, and the protection of crops. Many of these traditions stretch back hundreds of years. Even in the 20th century, some farmers quietly followed customs their ancestors would have recognized. One of those old beliefs involved iron. According to folklore, iron could break magical influence. It could trap evil spirits. It could even neutralize a witch's power. When villagers learned that Charles Walton had been pinned to the earth with an iron pitchfork, speculation exploded. Was the killer trying to make a statement? Or was someone carrying out a ritual rooted in ancient superstition? Those questions became even more unsettling when stories emerged claiming Walton himself had once been accused of being a witch. Whether those stories were true remains a matter of debate. But once they began circulating, they transformed the case from an unsolved murder into one of Britain's greatest paranormal mysteries. As Scotland Yard continued its investigation, detectives began collecting stories from local residents. Most of these stories amounted to little more than rumors, but one account stood out above the rest. It involved a local woman named Alice Martin. Over the years, Martin's story would become one of the most discussed aspects of the Charles Walton case. According to later reports, Martin claimed she had known Walton for much of her life. She allegedly believed there was something unusual about him dating back decades. One of the strangest stories she supposedly shared involved an incident from Walton's younger years. According to the tale, Walton was walking through a field when several birds suddenly dropped from the sky, dead. No gunshots, no obvious cause, just birds falling from above while Walton stood nearby. Now, before we go any further, it's important to point out that there is no hard evidence that this event actually happened. Like much of the Charles Walton story, the account comes through layers of retelling and folklore. But in a village already steeped in superstition, stories like that carried enormous weight. Some versions of the story became even more dramatic over time. They suggested Martin believed Walton possessed strange abilities. Others claimed she openly referred to him as a witch. Whether she actually used those words is impossible to verify. What we do know is that after Walton's death, these stories spread rapidly throughout the region. And once they did, people began viewing every aspect of his life through a supernatural lens. What had once been an ordinary farm laborer was slowly being transformed into a figure from local folklore. And that transformation would have a profound effect on the investigation. But the strangest part of the story wasn't the murder scene. To understand why the witchcraft theory gained so much attention, you need to understand the history of the area itself. Just a few miles from Meon Hill lies the village of Long Compton. For centuries, Long Compton has been associated with stories of witchcraft. The most famous legend dates back to the 17th century. According to local folklore, a group of villagers encountered a witch while traveling through the countryside. The witch allegedly cursed them, declaring that they would be transformed into stone. The result, according to the legend, is a nearby stone formation known as the Rollright Stones. Of course, historians view the story as folklore, but for generations, local people treated such tales seriously. Throughout the 17th century, accusations of witchcraft were not uncommon in the region. Women were suspected of casting curses. Livestock deaths were blamed on magic. Failed harvests became evidence of supernatural interference. By the 20th century, most people no longer believed in witches, at least publicly. Yet old beliefs have a way of surviving, especially in isolated rural communities. And when Charles Walton was murdered in such a strange manner, those ancient fears resurfaced almost immediately. To many locals, the crime seemed less like a modern murder and more like something pulled from England's distant past. What detectives learned next would transform the investigation. The bizarre nature of the crime quickly attracted national attention. Soon, Scotland Yard assigned one of its most experienced investigators to the case, Detective Chief Inspector Robert Fabian. Fabian had seen murders before, plenty of them. He was not easily rattled. But even Fabian would later admit that the Walton case was unlike anything he had encountered. As detectives interviewed villagers, they found themselves buried beneath an avalanche of rumors. Stories of curses, stories of witches, stories of secret rituals, stories of ancient grudges. Every conversation seemed to generate 3 new theories, and every lead eventually went nowhere. No witnesses came forward with useful information. No physical evidence pointed to a suspect, and no clear motive emerged. The investigation seemed trapped in quicksand. The deeper detectives dug, the more confusing the case became. Fabian later suggested that many of the witchcraft stories may have distracted attention from more practical investigative avenues. But even he couldn't fully dismiss the atmosphere surrounding the case. The entire region seemed haunted by its own history, and that history was making it incredibly difficult to separate fact from fiction. Then there was Meon Hill itself. Long before Walton's murder, the hill had acquired a reputation for strange happenings. Locals spoke of ghostly figures seen at night. Others reported mysterious lights. Some claimed they felt an overwhelming sense of dread while walking near the hill after dark. Now, skeptics would point out that isolated landscapes often attract folklore, and every country has locations associated with ghost stories, and that's certainly true. But what makes Meon Hill unusual is how many separate legends became attached to it over time. The hill seemed to function as a magnet for supernatural tales, and after Walton's murder, every one of those stories gained new life. Visitors arrived hoping to experience something paranormal. Writers searched for evidence connecting the murder to occult practices, and researchers explored local folklore looking for hidden clues. Yet despite decades of investigation, no one has found definitive evidence that anything supernatural occurred there. The mystery remains exactly that, a mystery. But perhaps that's why the story continues to endure, because Meon Hill feels like the perfect setting for an unsolved crime, a lonely place where reality and legend seem to blur together. So what actually happened to Charles Walton? More than 80 years later, nobody seems to know. But several theories continue to dominate discussion. The first theory is the simplest, a personal dispute. Perhaps Walton angered someone. Maybe there was a feud that never became public. The extreme violence certainly suggests strong emotions, but investigators never uncovered evidence supporting such a conflict. A second theory involves a mentally unstable killer. The brutality of the crime could indicate someone suffering from severe psychological disturbances, yet no suspect fitting that description was ever identified. Then there is the theory that made the case famous: ritual murder. Supporters of this idea point to the pitchfork, the location, the folklore, and the alleged accusations of witchcraft. To them, the murder appears symbolic rather than practical. However, investigators found no proof of organized occult activity, no ritual objects, no secret society, and no evidence beyond speculation. Finally, there's perhaps the most intriguing possibility. What if Charles Walton was killed by someone who genuinely believed he was a witch? Not because he practiced magic, not because witches exist, but because belief itself can be extremely powerful. Throughout history, countless innocent people have suffered because others became convinced they possessed supernatural abilities. Could something similar have happened here? Could an ancient superstition have motivated a modern murder? That possibility remains disturbingly plausible. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Charles Walton case is how much of the story has grown over time. Many people assume the witchcraft angle was proven. It wasn't. Others believe Scotland Yard officially concluded the murder was ritualistic. They didn't. In reality, much of what people think they know comes from decades of retellings. Books quoting earlier books, articles quoting earlier articles, stories evolving with each new generation. And that's not to say the folklore isn't important, it absolutely is. The folklore helps explain why this murder captured the public imagination. But when we strip away the legends, we're left with a stubborn reality. A man was murdered, and the killer was never identified. And despite one of the largest investigations in the region's history, no one was ever brought to justice. And that alone makes the case extraordinary. The witchcraft stories simply make it unforgettable. Maybe the most unsettling part of the Charles Walton story isn't just the brutality of the crime. It's not the pitchfork or the rumors of witchcraft. It's the year 1945. The Second World War was ending, and the world was entering a new age of science, technology, and modern thinking. And yet, in a quiet corner of England, people were still whispering about witches, talking about curses, and looking at tragedy through the lens of a centuries-old superstition. We like to think that those beliefs belong to a different time, but history shows us that old ideas don't simply disappear, they linger, sometimes for generations. Maybe Charles Walton was the victim of an ordinary killer, or maybe the rumors that surrounded him played a larger role than anyone cared to admit. We'll probably never know. But more than 80 years later, one question still remains. Was Charles Walton simply murdered by an ordinary person, or was he murdered because of a belief? And that could be the greatest mystery of it all.